Hello everyone, my name is Paulette Alatriste and I am a former student of Dr. Lopez's. I received my Bachelor of History from Fresno State in 2012 and I was in the master program studying women writers in Enlightenment Spain. Specifically, I studied the works of proto-feminist writer Josefa Amari Borbon, which I will introduce to you later in our lecture. Currently, I teach history for Fresno Unified School District. I'm really excited to be here today, even if remotely, and talk to you about women writers in the early modern period. So let's get started. All right. As you probably already know, throughout the early modern period, writing was very limited to women. The reason being that education was limited. Women might learn basic math and writing to be able to run a household successfully, but beyond that, it was rather rare for women to be educated in the letters, like their male counterparts. For example, in Italy, the first woman to officially graduate from a university was Elena Lucrezia Cornaro. She earned her doctorate in 1684. From the University of Padua, which was founded nearly 400 years before in the 13th century. Likewise, in England, the first woman to officially graduate from a university did not come until well into the 18th century. Now, this is not to say that women were completely barred from education. This is formal education, and therefore writing, as you have probably already learned from your other lectures by Dr. Lopez. However, what we can be certain about, education and in consequence writing, specifically women writers, it really takes off during the 18th century. In France alone, scholars estimate that approximately 300 women were officially published and in print. But this feminine literary revolution was not limited to just France. In fact, the number of women publishing in German-speaking states quadrupled over the course of the 18th century, and similar trends can be documented from England, Italy, and even Spain, which we will talk about today. What this tells us is that this enlightened republic of letters was as much an affair of women as it was of men. And it is important to remember that although this is the general direction of women writers, the pace at which women start to enter the public sphere differs from country to country, depending on how conservative societies were toward this trend. More on this later. In the 18th century, women throughout Europe, in increasingly unprecedented numbers, they threw themselves into the project of creating an expansive world of learning and into the public exchange of ideas. I would like to focus today specifically on Enlightenment era writers and their history, and we will look at one particular female author. Her name was Josefa Amari Borbon. We'll look at her world and we're going to look at her writings. So, talking about women writers in the 18th century, this cannot be done without first looking at a woman's purpose. It was a question that permeated throughout Europe, regardless of country or language. And in France, it was known as the Querelle des Femmes. In Spain, it was La Cuestión de la Mujer. And in England, we called it the woman question. And by we, I mean them. Clearly, I wasn't alive 200 years ago. But yes, this woman question. So what does it mean? Okay, the woman question debated the proper role of women and their participation in enlightened societies. Across various salons, intellectuals gathered to debate just how to promote the general welfare of the people. And one of the things that often came up is, what do we do with women? No, seriously, what would they do with these women? If you're a bit confused by this, that's okay. I'm about to explain it. So during the early modern period, and actually up until very recently, women have been thought of as not only physically, but intellectually inferior to men. And furthermore, people feared this idleness of women. What I mean by this is that often it was thought that if a woman did not have a specific purpose, a specific job, such as caring for children or running a household, then their idleness, having no purpose, that's going to get them into trouble. And if that gets them into trouble, then the rest of society will follow suit. And before you know it, you have a country that has descended into chaos. They really thought it was this bad. And that's bad. So many places, especially Spain, which is the country we're going to look at today, came up with practical solutions. Okay, so if women were to be relieved of their idleness and given a job to do, it should be done by a means of a practical education. So just remember, it's not that they were opposed to educating women, but it had to be a specific practical education, such as learning to sew or another job that befitted women's inferior intellectual capabilities. For the most part, women were barred from participating in intellectual societies or earning formal doctorate education at universities. So any education that was akin to that given to men was generally frowned upon during this time. And it is into this world that Josefa Amari Borbon is born. She's a fantastic person to study, not just because I looked at her while I was in the master's program, but for many reasons. So, Amari Borbon was born in Spain in the year 1749, and her case is not like that of many women at the time. She was born to a very privileged household. Her father was a doctor on the king's court, which means that Amari Borbon had a very privileged upbringing. Unlike most women of her social status, she was privy to classes with her brothers, and these guys were educated alongside the king's sons. So already, she's getting an education that most girls of her age, of her time, did not have access to. And what this meant is that she became a sort of savant. By the time she was 20, Amari Borbon is said to have been fluent in Spanish, Latin, Greek, Italian, English, French, Portuguese, and even Catalan. And they said that she dabbled in German. So that's like 8 languages. I don't know about you guys. I speak 2 fluently. A third one I understand rather well. But the idea of learning 8 languages and doing it fluently, so she's pretty cool that way. And because of this, she found employment doing something that most women would not do. So her job was to translate works of foreign philosophers, including, among others, people like John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So already at this stage in her life, she's getting exposed to all of these radical ideas of rights and equality that were not necessarily out there for other women of her time. But, at the end of the day, she was a woman, and like most ladies of the time, her father married her off to an older gentleman, and that should be that, right? Except that it's Amari Borbon. She had a lot to say. And she had a lot to say on that woman question. Because it was a pesky little question that thought idle women were a nuisance. And she's going to very, very overtly and publicly address that. So, at this time in Spain, there were several intellectual societies. They're similar to, or the counterparts to, the French and English salons, where people got together, they discussed everything from the economy to the new books that had come out, intellectual writers such as John Locke, Rousseau. All of these were being discussed at these societies. And in Spain in particular, the societies were sanctioned by the king. himself. The king was Carlos III at this time, and they had a purpose. It wasn't just that people met to discuss things, they met with a purpose, and the purpose for Spanish societies was the bettering of the population, the bettering of the people. How can we make them more efficacious? How can we make them better citizens? And furthermore, in these societies, only men were initially allowed. As we will see later, Amari Borbon is going to change all that. But the reason why they weren't allowed in societies originally is because they were talked about in a very bad light. So I have here a quote from the Real Sociedad of Madrid. And the quote says that women lacked virtue, they sinned, they were broken in the perception of a virtuous society, and they needed to be reined in. So that's the way that men were thinking about women and about what to do with them. That is the light in which they were seeing that woman question. Now, this is where I like to think that Amari Borbon was a badass, because she does not take that. So she does two things. First, she goes to the king himself, because remember, she had grown up in the king's court. And she sends him a letter, and she requests admittance to the Real Sociedad, which, like I said, had never been done before. Women hadn't been admitted. A couple times before, women had requested it, and no, they got like just capital N, capital O. Not going to happen. But she requests it, and the king is like, okay, we're not going to put you in the main society. We'll make a chapter of ladies. But what that means is that she gets her foot in the door. And then, so that's the first thing she does. And then the second thing she does is that she's going to very publicly and very directly call out men for saying these things about women. And she's going to publish an essay. So that brings me to my very first essay that she publishes, which is her most famous and original essay. It was published in 1786. It has a rather long name, but I'm fond of it. So in Spanish, the name was Discurso en defensa del talento de las mujeres y de su aptitud para el gobierno y otros cargos en que se emplean los hombres. All right, so now in English. Discourse on the defense and talent of women and of their aptitude for government and other things in which men work. It's a mouthful, but that is the title. Anyway, so there's a lot of things about this essay that make it cool. First, Amari Borbon wrote this before the more famous Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. You may have heard of her, and we'll talk about her later in our lecture. So anyway, this was written before Vindication, and this makes Amari Borbon one of the earliest defenders of women during the Enlightenment, who was herself a woman. Because up until this point, there were publications by men writers defending some limited qualities of women, but Amari Borbon, from what we can see, is one of the earliest who was herself a woman. And she does so in such a direct and in-your-face way that, it makes it hard to look away. I have here just a few of my favorite quotes from her essay, if I may. And she begins her essay by stating that, quote, "When God gave men the world with its many troubles, he knew that there would be infinite discussions over which they would always fight. One of these points seems to be women." So already she's setting the tone that men are always arguing about women, but do they ever stop to talk to these women? Here's another quote. She says, "On one hand, men deny women an education, and on the other, they complain that women are ignorant. And I say deny because there is no public establishment for the education of women." Direct quote. And here's another. "They blame women for everything. If heroes falter in their courage, if people are overcome with ignorance, if family values are corrupted. Evidently, all of these are just women's fault. But perhaps my favorite quote of all from this essay comes a bit later. She goes back, and I mean way, way back, to the fall of humanity from God's grace. If you may remember, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, Eve is deceived by the serpent or the devil, and she's tricked into eating the forbidden fruit. She then takes the fruit to Adam and offers him a bit, and he accepts, and they both eat it, and they get God angry in the process, who in turn punishes them both by kicking them out, expelling them from the Garden of Eden. So this is the concept of original sin, and during the early modern period, this concept was very much alive and well. And at the time that Amari Borbón is writing, it's also alive and well. So women are blamed for original sin, and because of that, it's obviously everything is women's fault, basically. Anyway, so back to Borbón. She brings up that men continuously blame women for the downfall of not just them, like all mankind, like anything that happens, and she claps back. So she says that, quote, she ate because she was curious, referring to Eve, while her husband did so knowing that eating the fruit was a sin, end quote. Essentially, she's arguing two things here. One, she says that Eve was deceived by the devil, which is a being far more cunning than a human, while Adam was not deceived. When he ate, he did so in complete disregard to God's laws. This is actually quite funny, I promise. Furthermore, Eve was curious. Borbón calls it a detestable curiosity, perhaps, but she says that, quote, curiosity is the foundation, the origin of talent, because curiosity is what drives people to learn things, end quote. So yeah, she's calling Adam dumb, and I love it. But anyway, so this, if you can imagine reading this, it was an affront to many people. Okay, so we know that she praises women openly, their intellectual capabilities, and their right to earn an education that went beyond practical math or sewing. Borbón even goes as far as explicitly stating that beyond the obviously physical differences, men and women were actually intellectual equals if they were both granted an equal education. Because of this, she said, women should immediately be granted access and membership to the economic societies of Spain, among many other things. And this was scandalous, you guys. As you can imagine, the essay was not received too well among her peers. In fact, her contemporaries, especially the leader of the Royal Society, openly criticized her boldness and lack of respect from men's noble intellectual superiority. It was published, in his published rebuttal to Borbón, the leader of the society, Francisco Cabarrús, stated, quote, women's inferiority and corrupt nature would only hinder proceedings, end quote. He also argued that women members were the exception. If you're going to have a woman become a member of the society, even if it's in the ladies chapter, they're the exception to women everywhere. And they're actually, well, in his words, rather manly. Why? Because women just didn't do those things. So contrary to these women, Cabarrús said, the female sex should, quote, perform domestic tasks to which women were destined, end quote. Further noting that women could not be considered good citizens unless they were mothers and wives. So these tips are going back and forth between Amari Borbón. They're publishing essays and they're publishing responses to each other. And I feel like if this had happened in 2020, these letters back and forth would have been on like the Daily Mail or TMZ. It was rather scandalous. Okay, so now we have Amari Borbón realizing, I would like to think, that you can't just openly call out the menfolk on their sexism. It's just too forward-thinking and too blunt for the time, which called for propriety and, modesty. So brilliantly, Amari Bourbon changed her strategy. And it took her 4 years, but she published a second, much longer essay meant as a manual for women everywhere. This time, Amari Bourbon is much more subdued. And I mean seemingly, because it really wasn't, okay? The name of the essay is this. It says, Discurso sobre la educación física y moral de las mujeres, which means discourse on the physical and moral education of women. It was meant as a manual of sorts for women and mothers. And the subject is, of course, the education of women and girls, which is very fitting, a very traditional women's role. Much more subdued. At first glance, the discourse appears to be conformist, okay? It suggests that women should accept their natural role in society. But in actuality, the undertone of the discourse is very different. It proposes that women educate themselves and their women and their children, their girls, from the start, so as to achieve a more equal society in the future. So I can only imagine if a person is picking up the book and they see the title, for the moral education of women and girls, and they read the first few pages and it says, women, you are responsible for your own education. You need to learn your place in the world. Well, at first glance, all right, you ladies stay where you need to be, right? But if you keep reading, you find out that it's giving women agency over their own education, which is very radical for its time. So this checks off all the boxes for men, right? Advocates for women to be mothers? Check. Are they in charge of the children? Check. Are they teaching the girls what the proper role of a gentlewoman, a lady is? Check. Will this prevent women from becoming idle? The age-old woman question. Check, check, check. So Bourbon essentially lines up her writing to appeal to men's ideas of the purpose of women, which also coincides with Republican motherhood. Now, what does that mean? Well, a very elevated version of Republican motherhood is that women's most important role in society was to become mothers, to educate their children properly, and to remain out of the public sphere. On the other hand, in order to educate children, the mother must herself be educated. So, to promote the education of women. Amari Bourbon is one of my favorite proto-feminists for this reason. And in the second part of this lecture series, we will go further into other types of writers, including the novel and things of that sort. So thank you for joining me for this first section. See you next time.